Part 1, the stars who actually went to jail. Night didn't shine the same way in old Hollywood. Past the glittering marquees and champagne premieres, there were back alleys where police sirens echoed louder than applause, and where some of Hollywood's brightest stars found themselves on the wrong side of the law. In a city built on illusions, these weren't rumors, scandals, or exaggerated headlines. These were real arrests, real trials, real prison sentences. For a few actors, fame couldn't shield them. Studios couldn't hide them. And no amount of charm could reopen the cell doors that closed behind them. These are the stars who didn't just fall from grace, they served time for it. And the first story begins with a man whose crime stunned early Hollywood. Number 1, Paul Kelly. He was supposed to be one of the good ones. A polished, respected stage actor with a rising career and a reputation for discipline. In the roaring 1920s, Paul Kelly wasn't a tabloid favorite or a Hollywood wildchild. He was the kind of performer critics admired, producers trusted, and audiences took seriously. Which is why the scandal that followed hit the industry like a bomb. The trouble began in 1927, on a night that should have ended with nothing more dramatic than raised voices and bruised egos. Kelly visited the home of Ray Raymond, a fellow actor and dancer whose marriage to actress Dorothy Mackay was cracking under the weight of rumors and jealousy. Accounts vary on what caused the argument: pride, alcohol, long simmering tensions. But what everyone agrees on is this: the confrontation escalated fast. By the time the shouting stopped, Raymond was lying on the ground, battered and barely conscious. Kelly, shaken but silent, left the house believing it had been a terrible fight. Nothing more. But the next day, Ray Raymond was dead. The coroner ruled the cause as traumatic peritonitis, a fatal complication caused by the blows he suffered. In an instant, Paul Kelly's career shattered, and he found himself at the center of one of Hollywood's earliest manslaughter trials. The courtroom was packed for weeks, not because Kelly was a megastar, but because the story was irresistible. A love triangle, a violent fight, a grieving widow. Hollywood in its infancy was already learning how scandal could overshadow talent, and this case had all the elements of a noir film long before noir was a genre. Kelly was convicted of first-degree manslaughter and sentenced to up to 10 years in San Quentin. For the public, it was a sharp reminder that the glamorous world of cinema wasn't immune to bloodshed. For the studios, it was an early warning that their actors' private lives could become front-page nightmares. Prison was not kind to Paul Kelly. Though he avoided the worst brutality of San Quentin thanks to his reputation and good behavior, the experience left deep marks. Fellow inmates later described him as stoic, almost unnervingly calm, a man determined to survive punishment without showing emotion. He worked in the prison garden, taught literacy classes, and kept to himself. He served a little over 2 years before earning parole for good behavior. But the real shock came after his release. Instead of returning quietly to the stage, Paul Kelly married Dorothy Mackay, the widow of the man whose death he caused. The public was outraged. Newspapers called it Hollywood's darkest romance. Critics predicted his career was finished forever. But Kelly did something few disgraced actors ever manage. He rebuilt. Slowly, cautiously, he began taking roles again. First on stage, then in films. And to the surprise of nearly everyone, audiences accepted him. He was talented. He was disciplined. And in the strange morality of early Hollywood, talent could be forgiven, even when tragedy couldn't. Through the 1930s and 1940s, Kelly appeared in dozens of films, from crime dramas to war pictures. He played soldiers, fathers, detectives, always with an intensity that seemed to come from someplace real, someplace heavy. Some critics argued that the manslaughter case actually deepened his acting, giving him a gravity younger performers couldn't yet touch. But no matter how many roles he played, Paul Kelly's story always carried a shadow. The public never fully forgot. Hollywood never fully forgave. And Kelly himself never publicly reflected on the night that destroyed one man's life and permanently altered his own. It's a reminder that in early Hollywood, redemption wasn't granted. It was earned through silence, hard work, and a willingness to live with ghosts. Number 2, Tom Neal. Tom Neal wasn't meant to become a Hollywood tragedy. In the early 1940s, he was handsome, athletic, charismatic, the kind of leading man who didn't need a studio to polish him. When he appeared in Detour, 1945, a bleak, low-budget noir that would later become a cult classic, audiences saw something raw in him. Neil didn't just play desperation. He seemed to understand it. His performance felt personal, unsettling, almost prophetic. But no one realized at the time just how close Tom Neal's real life would mirror the fatalism of the roles he played. Long before the scandal that destroyed him, Neal's life was already slipping into chaos. He had a quick temper, a jealous streak, and a habit of throwing himself into volatile relationships. The most infamous was with actress Barbara Payton, a woman whose beauty drew men into orbit and whose life became one of Hollywood's most tragic cautionary tales. Payton and Neal were magnetic, together and apart. Their relationship was passionate, volatile, and spiraling from the beginning. It reached its breaking point in 1951 when Neal brutally beat her fiancé, actor Franchot Tone, leaving Tone hospitalized with a shattered cheekbone, brain injuries, and a face he would never fully recover. Hollywood loves a scandal, but this one was too brutal to romanticize. Neal's career stalled instantly. Payton's followed soon after. He tried rebuilding, stage work, small films, low-budget westerns, but his reputation hung over him like a storm cloud. Studio executives called him uninsurable. Directors refused to gamble on him. Audiences remembered the story more than the man. Then came 1965, the year Tom Neal finally crossed the line that could not be undone. On a quiet day in Palm Springs, police responded to Neal's home, where they found the body of his third wife, Gail Bennett, lying on the bedroom floor. Neal claimed it was an accident. He said they had argued, emotions ran high, and in the struggle she fell, struck her head, and never woke up. But the investigators saw something else: signs of a violent altercation, inconsistencies in his account, and a pattern of behavior too dark to ignore. He was charged with involuntary manslaughter. The trial drew national attention, not because Neal was a major star, but because his story felt like a noir film bleeding into reality. A troubled former actor, a tragic death, a history of violence, a career stained by scandal. Hollywood didn't need to sensationalize anything. The facts were already sensational. Neal was convicted and sentenced to up to 15 years in a California state prison. He served only 6, earning parole in 1971. But unlike Paul Kelly, whose talent helped him rebuild, Tom Neal had no comeback waiting. Hollywood had long moved on, and the public had stopped caring. He lived his remaining years quietly, working as a landscaper and handyman in Palm Springs. A once promising star living in the shadow of what might have been. People who met him during those years described him as polite, withdrawn, almost haunted, as if he knew the world only remembered the darkness. In 1972, just 1 year after his release, Tom Neal died of a heart attack at age 58. No scandal, no headlines, no second act. He left behind a strange, chilling legacy, an actor who didn't just star in a film noir classic, he lived one. His life began with ambition and ended like a script he could never escape. Number 3, Robert Mitchum. By the late 1940s, Robert Mitchum was already a force in Hollywood. Tall, cool, sleepy-eyed, and impossible to intimidate. He didn't seem like a man who cared about fame, or rules, or consequences. He moved through Hollywood like someone who understood on some instinctive level that nothing could really touch him. Which is why, on the night of August 31st, 1948, when police raided a small house in Laurel Canyon, the world was shocked. But Mitchum wasn't. Inside the home, officers found Mitchum and 20-year-old actress Lila Leeds lounged among ashtrays, scattered magazines, in the faint haze of prohibited smoke. In an era when moral purity was part of the studio brand, this was dynamite. A movie star and a young actress caught red-handed. No rumor, no speculation, a real arrest. Studios panicked, publicists scrambled. But Mitchum? He leaned back, looked straight into the flashing news cameras, and smirked. That smirk, defiant, amused, unbothered, became the most famous mugshot of the decade. The case was fast and brutal. Mitchum pleaded guilty to marijuana possession, a serious offense under California's strict narcotics laws. Judges made an example of him. Newspapers sharpened their knives. He was sentenced to 60 days in jail and 2 years of probation. Hollywood waited for the backlash. They expected outrage, boycotts, a career in flames. Instead, something strange happened. Audiences loved it. They weren't angry. They were fascinated. Mitchum's arrest didn't tarnish his cool guy image. It cemented it. Suddenly, he wasn't just a tough actor. He was a real rebel, someone who didn't bend to Hollywood's fake moral standards. Meanwhile, the fallout for Lila Leeds was devastating. She lost work, was abandoned by studios, and struggled for decades. But Mitchum, the bigger name, the box office draw, became even more magnetic. While serving his sentence at the Los Angeles County Jail and later at an honor farm in Castaic, Mitchum worked in the fields, sweated under the sun, and joked with guards. When reporters showed up, he shrugged and said, "It's just like Palm Springs, but without the riffraff." That line alone reaffirmed his brand: untouchable, unshaken, unfiltered. When he walked out of custody in March 1949, he stepped straight into the premiere of Rachel and the Stranger, which became a surprise hit. Instead of punishing him, the scandal made him more bankable. Even the studios, wary at first, realized they had accidentally struck gold. Mitchum wasn't just a star now, he was an icon. But beneath the swagger, the arrest changed him. Friends said he became more cynical, more detached, more convinced that Hollywood was a game he could play better than anyone. The industry had tried to break him, and instead handed him a legend. Mitchum went on to star in some of the most influential noirs ever made: Out of the Past, The Night of the Hunter, Cape Fear. Roles that required a man who could be charming one moment and dangerous the next. A man who had seen both sides of the law and understood the thin line between them. Robert Mitchum didn't survive scandal. He thrived on it. His arrest should have been a career-ending humiliation. Instead, it became one of the greatest accidental publicity boosts in Hollywood history. The moment when Robert Mitchum stopped being a star and became a myth. Number 4, Spade Cooley. Before the darkness, there was music. Spade Cooley wasn't just famous, he was adored. In the 1940s, he ruled American entertainment with a blend of charm, swagger, and Western swing that filled dance halls across the country. They called him the King of Western Swing, a title he embraced as if it were written in stone. He played to sold-out crowds, starred in films, and even hosted one of the earliest television music shows in Los Angeles. To the outside world, Spade Cooley was the perfect American success story, but behind the polished stage persona lay a man unraveling from the inside. By 1961, Cooley's fame was fading, but his temper was only getting sharper. Long-standing jealousy, suspicion, and anger were poisoning his marriage to Ella Mae Cooley, a woman who had once been his musical partner and the mother of his children. Friends whispered about the bruises she hid, the excuses she made, the fear she tried to disguise. On April 3, 1961, that fear became reality. Police were called to the Cooley home in Kern County, where they found Ella Mae dead after what investigators described as a brutal and prolonged attack. The details were horrifying, so the kind that newspapers struggled to print in full, even in an era accustomed to sensationalism. What made everything worse was the presence of the couple's young daughter, who would later testify about the violence she witnessed. Hollywood was stunned, audiences were horrified, and Spade Cooley's empire collapsed overnight. He was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial became a national spectacle. In the courtroom, Cooley appeared thinner and shaken, as if the swagger that had defined him for decades had evaporated in an instant. His defense argued insanity, emotional breakdown, anything that could soften the brutality of the crime. But the testimony was overwhelming. For a man who once commanded studios, stages, and audiences, he now faced something he couldn't charm or intimidate: the truth. Cooley was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Inside the Vacaville Medical Facility, he was a ghost of the showman he once was. But unlike other fallen stars, Cooley adapted quickly. He organized concerts for inmates, taught music classes, and tried to rebuild his image as a man seeking redemption. Some guards even described him as polite, cooperative, a model prisoner. But redemption was a story only Hollywood could write. Reality would not be so kind. In 1969, after 8 years behind bars, Cooley was granted a temporary release to perform at a charity concert for law enforcement. It was meant to be a symbolic moment, the fallen king stepping briefly back into the light, proving he had changed. The concert was a success. Cooley was applauded, congratulated, embraced by old friends who remembered better days. For a few hours, he felt like a star again. Then, moments after stepping off stage, Spade Cooley collapsed, a fatal heart attack. Dead before the ambulance arrived, the man who had spent a lifetime chasing applause died standing backstage, heartbroken under the weight of everything he had done. There was no comeback, no final act, only a cautionary tale, one of the darkest in Hollywood's history, about a king who destroyed his own kingdom with anger he could never control. Number 5, Frances Farmer. Frances Farmer arrived in Hollywood like a storm. Brilliant, unpredictable, and impossible to control. She wasn't just talented, she was electric. Audiences loved her. Critics praised her. Studios wanted to shape her into the next great leading woman. But Frances had no interest in playing by Hollywood's rules. She despised the fake smiles, the publicity stunts, the manufactured romances. She wanted to act, not perform for an industry machine. And in the golden age of Hollywood, that kind of independence was a sin. Farmer's trouble began not with a crime, but with an attitude. She refused to pose for stage photographs, turned down social events arranged by the studio, and talked openly about politics during a time when actresses were expected to stay silent. Gossip columnists called her difficult, defiant, and ungrateful. Executives called her dangerous. The public called her fascinating. But the pressure of fame, the real fame, the kind without protection, began to wear on her. She drank, drove recklessly, and found herself in more arguments than auditions. And then, on a cold night in 1942, everything spiraled. Farmer was stopped by Santa Monica police after a minor traffic violation. The incident should have ended with a ticket. Instead, she lashed out, refusing to cooperate. When officers tried to detain her, she fought back. In court days later, she appeared visibly exhausted, irritated, and out of patience with the world. When the judge ordered her to pay a fine, she said she didn't have the money and didn't care. That was all it took. A warrant was issued when she missed a follow-up hearing. Police found her at the Knickerbocker Hotel, where witnesses described a chaotic, heartbreaking scene. Frances refused to leave. Officers dragged her through the lobby as she screamed, cried, and begged them to stop. Flashbulbs exploded as newspapers captured the moment. The fall of a rising star. She was convicted of disorderly conduct and sentenced to 180 days in jail. Her time behind bars was rough, but it was nothing compared to what came next. In 1944, after increasingly erratic behavior, Farmer was declared mentally unfit and committed to Western State Hospital in Washington State. There she underwent a series of harsh treatments typical of the era, treatments that would later spark decades of controversy. Some reports spoke of sedation, restraints, and electroshock therapy. Others claimed even darker, unverified horrors. The truth is complicated, but what's undeniable is this. Frances Farmer entered the hospital as a rebellious actress and left as a woman who had lost years of her life to a system she couldn't fight. When she was finally released in 1950, Farmer tried to rebuild. She worked in a hotel laundry room. She hosted a small local TV show. She returned to the stage for a brief promising run. But the spark the world once saw, that fire that made her unforgettable, was dimmed, if not extinguished. Hollywood didn't welcome her back. It never does for those it can no longer use. Farmer spent the rest of her life in quiet isolation, far from the cameras that once chased her. When she died in 1970, she left behind a legacy not of scandal, but of tragedy, a reminder of what happens when a fiercely independent woman collides with an industry built on control. Frances Farmer was punished not for a crime, but for refusing to bend. Number 6, Lila Leeds. Long before she became a cautionary tale, Lila Leeds was a dreamer. She arrived in Hollywood fresh-faced and hopeful, just another young actress trying to carve out a place in a town that ate hope for breakfast. Casting directors noticed her immediately. The blonde curls, the soft voice, the innocence that seemed manufactured for the screen, but was in truth painfully real. She was not destined to become a superstar, but she was destined for something far crueler. In 1948, Leeds shared the small Laurel Canyon house with a few friends, a cozy, bohemian hideout where actors gathered to escape the pressure of auditions and studio demands. On the night of August 30, she and Robert Mitchum sat together, smoking, talking, unwinding like young people do when they think the world isn't watching. Except the world was watching, or rather the Los Angeles Police Department was. When officers burst through the door, the two actors were caught in a haze of prohibited smoke. The headlines wrote themselves, "Hollywood star Robert Mitchum arrested with blonde actress." Mitchum's name alone was enough to make it the story of the week. But for Leeds, just 20 years old, it became the story of a lifetime. Both were charged. Both were photographed, interrogated, dragged across the front pages. But here's where fate, or Hollywood's hypocrisy, drew a brutal line. Robert Mitchum's arrest became a badge of rebellious honor. Lila Leeds' arrest became a curse. When the judge handed down the sentence, 60 days in jail, they served the time together in the same honor farm. Mitchum chopped weeds, posed for photos, and turned the punishment into a public relations boost. Meanwhile, Leeds faded quietly into the background, unnoticed except for the headlines that painted her as wayward, troubled, and dangerous. After jail, Mitchum walked out to a hit movie and a waiting career. Lila Leeds walked out to nothing. The studios blacklisted her overnight. She lost her agent, her friends, her income. The same reporters who praised Mitchum's coolness printed stories calling her a moral threat to Hollywood's youth. She tried to rebuild. She really did. She dyed her hair brunette, hoping to escape the blonde bombshell image tied to her arrest. She took smaller roles. She tried stage work. But the stain would not wash off. In 1949, she starred in She Shoulda Said No, a cheap exploitation film that capitalized on her real arrest. It was meant to be her comeback. Instead, it was the final stamp that locked her into a tragic caricature, Hollywood's fallen girl. The film made money, Leeds did not. Behind the publicity stills and forced smiles, her life spiraled. She struggled with addiction, poverty, and a grief that no one in the industry cared to see. By the late 1950s, Lila Leeds had vanished from the very world that once promised her everything. She drifted across small towns, took odd jobs, and lived in a shadow so deep it swallowed her whole. In 1999, she died quietly in Florida. No red carpets, no tributes, no acknowledgement from the industry that helped destroy her. Only a single haunting fact remained. Two actors were arrested that night. One became a legend. The other became a warning. Lila Leeds wasn't the Hollywood bad girl the papers claimed she was. She was simply young, hopeful, and unlucky enough to be standing next to the wrong star when the flash bulbs exploded. Number 7, Lawrence Tierney. In the 1940s, Hollywood loved tough guys. But Lawrence Tierney wasn't acting. He wasn't performing. He wasn't pretending to brood for the camera. The danger that audiences saw on screen in Dillinger, 1945, wasn't crafted by dialogue or coaching. It was real, pulsing just under the surface, waiting for the smallest spark to ignite. Tierney had the looks of a matinee idol and the temperament of a street brawler. Broad shoulders, jaw like a brick. Eyes that seemed to watch the room for threats nobody else could see. When Dillinger made him a star overnight, Warner Brothers believed they'd found their next hard-edged leading man. Gritty, masculine, unpredictable. They were right about the last part, but they had no idea how uncontrollable he really was. Off camera, Tierney lived like the characters he played. Bars, late nights, fistfights. It was less a lifestyle than a gravitational pull he couldn't resist. He didn't drink casually. He drank like it was part of his bloodstream. And when he drank, the world around him became a series of provocations waiting to explode. Police records from the late 1940s read like a chronicle of chaos. Bar brawls, public disturbances, disorderly conduct, assault. Newspapers printed the stories with thinly veiled shock, but audiences weren't surprised. In a strange way, it only added to his mystique. Tierney wasn't the kind of man Hollywood tried to clean up. He was the man Hollywood tried and failed to contain. The arrest that finally slowed him down came in 1951 after yet another drunken altercation turned violent. This time the damage was serious, and the court had little patience left. Tierney was sentenced to a short jail term, a punishment that should have been a turning point for any actor who valued stardom. But Lawrence Tierney was not any actor. He seemed to treat jail the same way he treated fame, as something he could walk through without changing. When he was released, studios tried again. Producers wanted to believe they could harness his intensity, turn it into box office gold. But the volatile behavior continued. Directors found him impossible to control. Insurance companies refused to cover any production that hired him. One producer famously said, "Casting Tierney is like lighting a match in a gas-filled room." His career, once blazing, dimmed to almost nothing. And yet there was charisma in his destruction, a strange, magnetic authenticity. Tierney wasn't self-destructive for publicity. He didn't play the rebel to sell tickets. He simply couldn't live any other way. The same rage that made him unforgettable on screen made him impossible to keep there. Decades passed. Tierney drifted through odd jobs, low-budget films, and failed comeback attempts. He worked as a bartender, a night guard, anything that would keep the bills paid. His once promising career lay scattered behind him like broken glass. Then in the 1990s, a young director named Quentin Tarantino cast him as Joe Cabot in Reservoir Dogs. Tarantino called him the real deal, a relic of a Hollywood that no longer existed. Tierney brought the same intimidating presence he had in the 1940s, but now it felt mythical, like watching a ghost wander back onto the screen for one final performance. Even that comeback wasn't smooth. Tarantino later admitted that Tierney got into a fight on set with him and was never invited back. Lawrence Tierney died in 2002, leaving behind a legacy carved out by violence, talent, and a refusal to bend to anything, including Hollywood. He was the only star on this list whose downfall didn't come from one terrible moment, but from a lifetime of them. He wasn't ruined by a scandal. He was the scandal. For these stars, prison wasn't just a punishment. It was the moment when the spotlight turned cold, revealing the shadows they'd been hiding all along. Some rebuilt their lives, some never recovered, and some carried their ghosts to the very end. But in old Hollywood, not every downfall ended with a jail cell. Sometimes the harshest sentences weren't handed down by judges, but by the newspapers, the gossip columns, and a public hungry for scandal. Because the next group of stars didn't serve time behind bars. They served time in the court of public opinion, a courtroom far more ruthless than any prison. Part 2 begins with the legends destroyed not by crime, but by headlines. Part 2, the trials, scandals, and headlines that destroyed careers. Hollywood didn't need a courtroom to destroy a star. In the golden age, one headline could unravel a career faster than any judge's sentence. A single accusation, true or not, could ignite a national frenzy powerful enough to erase a lifetime of work. Studios tried to manage the fallout. Publicists lied, lawyers begged, but once the press turned a name into a target, there was no escape. Some of these actors were proven innocent. Others were never charged at all. Yet every one of them paid a price far harsher than prison. They lost their reputations, their careers, and in some cases, their place in Hollywood history. And it begins with a man who was once America's most beloved comedian, until scandal turned him into Hollywood's first great exile. Number 1, Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle, the innocent man Hollywood never forgave. Before the scandal, Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle was one of the biggest stars in America. A comedy giant whose films packed theaters and whose charm made audiences forget the weight behind his name. In the silent era, only Charlie Chaplin matched his fame. He was adored, trusted, and seen as a harmless entertainer who made the world laugh during difficult times. But in September 1921, all of that changed in a single night. Arbuckle traveled to San Francisco with friends for a weekend party at the St. Francis Hotel. There were drinks, music, laughter, a typical celebration for Hollywood's new royalty. Among the guests was Virginia Rappe, a young actress whose career was beginning to gain momentum. At some point during the party, Rapp fell ill, suffering severe abdominal pain. She was taken to the hospital where she died a few days later from complications of a ruptured bladder. The moment the news broke, the story twisted into something monstrous. Almost overnight, Arbuckle became the villain of a crime he didn't commit. Hearst newspapers, the most powerful media empire of the time, saw an opportunity. Sensational headlines sold papers, and Arbuckle's fame made him a perfect target. They printed fabricated stories, lurid details, and accusations so graphic that they shocked the entire country. America didn't wait for facts. They made up their minds instantly. Roscoe Arbuckle was guilty. The city erupted in outrage. Churches called for boycotts. Politicians demanded his execution. Theater owners burned his films in the street. Overnight, America's most beloved comedian became its most hated man. Arbuckle was arrested and charged with manslaughter. What followed were three of the most sensational trials in Hollywood history. Trial 1, deadlock jury. Despite the lack of evidence, in testimony confirming Arbuckle never harmed Rapp, the jury couldn't agree. Public anger drowned out the truth. Trial 2, deadlocked again. Witnesses contradicted each other. Rumors spread faster than facts. Newspapers continued fabricating details to keep the scandal alive. Trial 3, full acquittal, and an apology. On April 12, 1922, the jury returned not just a not guilty verdict, but a written apology, a rare gesture of absolute exoneration. They stated that Roscoe Arbuckle had been gravely wronged, but the apology came far too late. Hollywood didn't take him back. America didn't forgive him. The studios banned his films, canceled his contracts, and erased his name from marquees. The man proven innocent was treated as if he were guilty forever. Unable to return publicly, Arbuckle worked behind the scenes under a pseudonym, William Goodrich, a quiet, almost tragic symbol of what he had lost. His income shrank, his health deteriorated, his spirit dimmed. The laughter he once brought millions seemed to have been stolen from him. In 1933, the studios finally offered him a chance. He signed a contract with Warner Brothers to star in a new series of comedies. For the first time in a decade, Roscoe Arbuckle felt hope. He never lived to fulfill it. That same night, after celebrating his long-awaited comeback, Arbuckle suffered a heart attack and died in his sleep at the age of 46. A man proven innocent, broken by a crime he never committed, destroyed not by guilt, but by headlines, hysteria, and the cruelty of a world eager for a villain. His story is a reminder that in old Hollywood, the truth didn't always matter. The narrative did. Number 2, the golden boy who walked into Hollywood's most explosive trial. In the early 1940s, Errol Flynn was the closest thing America had to a real-life adventure hero. He wasn't just a movie star. He was a fantasy. The sword-fighting rogue, the mischievous charmer, the man who leapt from ships and climbed castle walls with a grin that promised danger and delight in the same breath. Women adored him. Men wanted to be him. Studios banked entire fortunes on his smile. And then, in 1942, that smile vanished from posters and reappeared on the front pages of every newspaper in the country. Two teenage girls, Betty Hansen and Peggy Satterlee, came forward with explosive accusations of statutory misconduct against Flynn. The allegations shook Hollywood to its core. America watched as their swashbuckling hero was suddenly yanked off the pedestal they had placed him on. The details were salacious enough to keep the press printing nonstop. Hearst newspapers in particular smelled blood and profit. They splashed Errol Flynn's scandal across headlines, painting him as a predator long before he ever set foot in a courtroom. For a moment, it seemed like Flynn's legendary career was over. When the trial began in early 1943, the courtroom became a spectacle worthy of Hollywood itself. Lines formed outside hours before the doors opened. Fans screamed for him as if it were a film premiere. Reporters elbowed each other for seats, desperate for every glance, gesture, or whisper. And Flynn played his role perfectly. He walked into the courtroom with the same swagger he brought to Captain Blood. He smiled, he joked, he winked at spectators. The press had tried to reduce him to a headline, but Flynn turned the trial into a performance, and he performed brilliantly. The prosecution's case quickly grew shaky. The girls' testimonies were inconsistent. Rumors of coaching circulated. Witnesses contradicted each other, and Flynn's high-powered lawyers exploited every flaw. But the most powerful force in the courtroom wasn't evidence or legal strategy. It was Errol Flynn himself. He radiated charm, confidence, and a devil-may-care confidence that made people want to believe him. His fans, mostly women, filled the gallery wearing buttons that read, "I'm for Flynn." The trial stretched for weeks, each day filled with sensational claims and dramatic cross-examinations. But on February 9, 1943, the jury delivered the verdict that echoed through Hollywood. Not guilty, acquitted on all counts. Flynn walked out of the courthouse a free man, legally at least. But even an acquittal couldn't erase the stain. His reputation was altered forever. The trial gave birth to a phrase that followed him for the rest of his life, "in like Flynn," a slang expression meaning quick success in romantic pursuits, the kind of dark, backhanded immortality that Hollywood specializes in. Some say the scandal changed him. He drank more. He partied harder. He leaned even further into the reckless persona the world now expected from him. Flynn continued making films, good ones, even great ones. But he was no longer the untouchable golden boy. There was always a shadow now, a whisper, a reminder of the trial that nearly ended him. He died in 1959 at just 50 years old, his body worn down by excess, his legend permanently tangled with controversy. Errol Flynn was acquitted, but he was never truly freed. In old Hollywood, sometimes the verdict mattered less than the story the world chose to believe. Number 3, Hedy Lamarr, the most beautiful woman in the world, reduced to a headline. Before the scandal, Hedy Lamarr seemed almost unreal. A woman whose beauty was so striking that even other actresses whispered about it. She arrived in Hollywood in the late 1930s like a force of nature. Luminous skin, sculpted cheekbones, eyes that looked like they were painted for the screen. Louis B. Mayer famously introduced her as the most beautiful woman in the world, and audiences believed it. But beneath the glamour was something far more impressive. Lamarr was a scientific mind, a restless thinker, an inventor. She worked late into the night, sketching designs, taking apart machines, dreaming of technology that would one day change the world. Hollywood never cared about that part. They wanted the beauty, not the brilliance. And when her life began to crack, they preferred the scandal over the truth. In 1966, long after her days as an A-list star, Hedy Lamarr walked into a department store in Los Angeles. She was older now, private, almost reclusive. Time had taken her fame, but not the curiosity that followed her. When security accused her of shoplifting cosmetics, the story exploded across the country within hours. Hedy Lamarr arrested for shoplifting. The headlines didn't mention her inventions. They didn't mention her wartime patents. They didn't mention her brilliance. They mentioned her beauty and her downfall. Lamarr insisted it was a misunderstanding. She said the items had been placed in her bag by mistake, and within days the charge was dropped entirely. Legally, the case should have ended there. But Hollywood's cruelty never needed a courtroom. The press weaponized her age, her fading career, her vulnerability. Gossip columnists mocked her, calling the arrest a sad end, or proof that even the brightest stars fade badly. Television hosts made jokes. Audiences who once adored her now consumed her humiliation like entertainment. But what they didn't know, or chose not to see, was the quiet tragedy behind the headlines. Hedy Lamarr had spent years battling loneliness, disappointment, and the emotional aftermath of a lifetime of being seen but never understood. Hollywood had celebrated her appearance but dismissed her intellect. During World War II, she co-invented a frequency-hopping communication system designed to protect Allied torpedoes from enemy signal jamming. Her technology would eventually become the foundation for Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and GPS. Jenna, the woman mocked for a shoplifting misunderstanding, helped invent the wireless world. But in the 1960s, no one cared. Not the studios, not the public, not the industry she had once dazzled. Her arrest became a symbol, not of criminality, but of how brutally Hollywood treated aging women. Where Paul Kelly was forgiven, where Robert Mitchum became a legend, Hedy Lamarr was discarded the moment her beauty was no longer enough. After the scandal, Lamarr withdrew from public life almost completely. She lived quietly, avoiding cameras, interviews, and attention. For decades, she was a ghost. A woman whose face had once sold millions of movie tickets, now forgotten by the very machine she had fueled. But time has a way of rewriting history. By the late 1990s, her inventions were finally recognized. Engineers, scientists, and historians credited her contributions to modern communication technology. She received awards, tributes, and acknowledgments, most of them arriving too late for her to fully enjoy. Hedy Lamarr died in 2000, not as a shoplifter, not as a scandal, but as a woman whose brilliance had been ignored in life and celebrated only in death. Her story is one of Hollywood's greatest tragedies, a reminder that beauty may open doors, but brilliance is often the thing the world refuses to see. Number 4. Lionel Atwill, the gentleman of horror brought down by a single lie. Before the scandal, Lionel Atwill was Hollywood royalty of a very particular kind. The gentleman of horror. With his aristocratic voice, sharp features, and commanding presence, Atwill elevated every role he touched. Whether he played a mad doctor, a sinister scientist, or a calculating murderer, he approached each performance with elegance, intelligence, and precision. Critics admired him, audiences respected him, directors trusted him. But it wasn't a role that destroyed him. It was a moment of fear, and a single lie that spiraled into the end of his career. It began quietly in 1942, with whispers surrounding a private party at Atwill's Los Angeles home. The gathering, attended by industry colleagues and acquaintances, was meant to be discreet. A night of drinks, music, and adult indulgence away from the studio system's watchful eye. But when police investigated an unrelated matter, rumors spread that the party had been more scandalous than anyone admitted. Hollywood panicked. The industry was already under pressure from morality groups and government watchdogs. Any hint of impropriety, especially of the sexual kind, could trigger investigations that threatened the studio's carefully crafted, family-friendly image. And Lionel Atwill, unfortunately, was in the center of the storm. When questioned, Atwill provided testimony downplaying the nature of the gathering. He omitted details, softened the edges, and attempted to protect both himself and his guests. It wasn't a dramatic attempt to deceive. It wasn't even malicious. But in the eyes of the law, and in the era of moral panic, it was enough. Atwill was charged with perjury, accused of giving false and evasive testimony. The trial was swift. The prosecution framed him not as a criminal mastermind, but as a man who had misled the court to hide something sordid. Whether that was true hardly mattered. The scandal had already taken on a life of its own. In a desperate attempt to limit damage, Atwill revised his statements, clarifying details he had previously softened. It wasn't enough. He pleaded guilty to the charge and was sentenced to 5 years of probation. No prison time, no violent crime, no dramatic downfall. But Hollywood didn't care about the severity. They cared about the stain. Studios severed ties instantly. Contracts vanished. Directors stopped calling. Insurance companies refused to cover any film that hired him. This was the silent punishment, the one far more devastating than a jail sentence. The industry that once embraced him now treated his name like a liability. Atwill, humiliated but determined, tried to work again. And for a time he succeeded, but only in low-budget productions, small horror pictures that relied more on his voice than his reputation. Gone were the prestige roles, the Universal Pictures contracts, the dignified characters he once mastered. He became a shadow of the star he had been. By the mid-1940s, his health began to decline. Once strong and stately, he now fought through exhaustion and illness to continue acting. He refused to quit, perhaps because work was the only part of his identity Hollywood hadn't stripped from him. Lionel Atwill died in 1946, not disgraced, not forgotten, but diminished. A man whose legacy was overshadowed by one mistake in a time when Hollywood demanded perfection. His story is quieter than many on this list. There was no shocking crime, no sensational arrest, no violent scandal. Only a man cornered by fear, punished by a system that found it easier to destroy him than to understand him. In the end, Lionel Atwill wasn't ruined by wrongdoing. He was ruined by Hollywood's terror of imperfection and the lie told to protect a truth the world wasn't ready to hear. Number 5, Clara Bow, the it girl destroyed by lies, gossip, and a world that wanted to break her. Before Marilyn Monroe, before Jean Harlow, before the era of blonde bombshells defined Hollywood glamour, there was Clara Bow, the original it girl. She wasn't trained, polished, or molded by the studios. She didn't need to be. Clara possessed something far more powerful, a raw magnetism that leapt off the screen and straight into the hearts of millions. Her smile lit up silent film frames. Her energy reshaped the idea of what a movie star could be. And in the mid-1920s, she was the most famous woman in America. But fame attracts shadows, and Clara's shadow swallowed her whole. Unlike many stars of her era, Bow didn't come from wealth, privilege, or connections. She grew up in poverty in Brooklyn, surviving a childhood filled with trauma most people couldn't imagine. When she arrived in Hollywood, she didn't understand its politics, and she didn't know the rules designed to crush anyone too genuine, too open, too alive. Gossip columnists studied her like predators. Studio executives envied her independence. Jealous rivals whispered that she was too wild, too free, too real. And then came Daisy DeVoe. DeVoe was Bow's personal secretary, a woman who knew her routines, her anxieties, her weaknesses, and who held access to her private correspondence. In 1931, after Clara fired her for financial misconduct, DeVoe retaliated with a scandal so vicious it nearly destroyed Bow's mind. She accused Clara of almost everything: gambling, drug use, sexual misconduct, immoral behavior. Each claim more sensational than the last. None of it was backed by evidence. Most of it was pure invention. But in an era where Hollywood gossip columns sold more newspapers than actual news, facts didn't matter. The trial that followed wasn't about justice. It was a public dissection. DeVoe was ultimately convicted of grand theft. Not Clara, but the damage had already been done. The newspapers printed every lie in bold letters and buried the corrections in tiny print weeks later. Fan magazines mocked her. Columnists called her unstable, uncontrolled, morally unfit. Clara Bow, the biggest star of her generation, became a spectacle. Silent Hollywood had forgiven much worse from its male actors, but Clara was a woman who lived freely, and that was a crime the system refused to allow. The relentless humiliation began to break her. The joy she once brought to the screen was swallowed by anxiety, insomnia, and public scrutiny. Her final films were haunted by a sadness her fans didn't understand. Studio executives, once desperate to cast her in everything, quietly backed away. And then, at only 26 years old, Clara Bow walked away from Hollywood. No grand farewell, no dramatic exit, just a young woman exhausted by fame she never asked for. She spent the next decades living quietly on a Nevada ranch with her husband, cowboy actor Rex Bell. She raised 2 sons. She avoided cameras, and she rarely spoke of the industry that had once worshipped her, then devoured her. When Clara Bow died in 1965, Hollywood remembered her as a star, but not a survivor, not a victim, not a woman who fought a war against gossip, misogyny, and the cruelty of a system built to break women like her. Today, her story stands as one of the clearest examples of how old Hollywood didn't just make icons. It destroyed them with equal passion. Clara Bow wasn't defeated by scandal. She was defeated by lies. Number 6, Tallulah Bankhead, Hollywood's wildest woman who refused to be controlled. Before scandal defined her, Tallulah Bankhead was a storm wrapped in silk, a woman so impossibly charismatic that entire rooms fell silent when she walked in. Born into political privilege in Alabama, she could have lived a safe, scripted life. Instead, she ran toward chaos with open arms and a cigarette balanced between 2 perfectly manicured fingers. Tallulah wasn't just a star, she was a force of nature. When she arrived in Hollywood in the early 1930s, the studio executives had no idea what to do with her. She swore like a sailor. She drank like prohibition had never happened. She seduced whoever she wanted, regardless of what the morality police or the press thought. And she delivered lines with a husky, magnetic voice that seemed impossible for the microphone to tame. She was everything Hollywood feared, and everything it desperately wanted. But Tallulah Bankhead's war wasn't with the law, it was with the rules. In an era when actresses were expected to be polished, wholesome, and tightly managed, Tallulah did the opposite. She mocked the production code, partied with gangsters, flirted with scandal, and gave interviews so outrageous they became legend. She once told a reporter, "My heart was not in the film, my lungs were." It was the kind of comment that made producers wince and audiences laugh, but the chaos that made her famous also made her vulnerable. By the mid-1930s, tabloids circled her like vultures. Every night out became a headline. Every rumor became truth. Every joke became evidence that she wasn't fit for stardom. In a world terrified of morally complicated women, Tallulah was the most complicated woman of all. Her private life became public sport. Her drinking was mocked. Her relationships were sensationalized. Her sexuality, fluid, unapologetic, became the favorite target of gossip columnists hungry for scandal. When she clashed with a producer, newspapers printed it. When she fired a maid, they printed that too. When she showed up late to rehearsals, it became proof that she was out of control. The truth is that Tallulah Bankhead didn't face a single career-ending scandal. She faced 1,000 small assassinations, delivered daily by an industry terrified of a woman who refused to behave. One of the most damaging blows came when she contracted a severe, life-threatening case of venereal disease in 1933. She nearly died, required a hysterectomy, and was hospitalized for weeks. When the story leaked, the press didn't treat her as a patient. They treated her as entertainment. Her medical tragedy became a punchline. Hollywood turned its back. Studios deemed her unreliable and uninsurable, the same labels that destroyed Lawrence Tierney decades later. Offers vanished, roles dried up. Directors refused to gamble on a woman who wouldn't play nice. For a moment, it seemed like the industry had won. Tallulah Bankhead, the wildest woman in Hollywood, had been silenced. But Tallulah refused to disappear. She went back to the stage, where she delivered some of the finest performances of her life, including Hitchcock's Lifeboat, a role that revived her career and earned her the deepest respect she had ever received. She performed brilliantly, dangerously, fearlessly, the way she always had. Tallulah Bankhead didn't lose her career to a single mistake. She lost it to a system that demanded obedience, and to a world not ready for a woman who lived louder than the spotlight. To the end of her life, she remained unapologetic. Tallulah didn't fall from grace. She jumped, laughing, and dared Hollywood to follow. Number 7, Charlie Chaplin, the man who made the world laugh, then became its enemy. Long before the scandal, Charlie Chaplin was untouchable. The little tramp, bowler hat, cane, mustache, was more than a character. He was a symbol of hope. During the darkest years of the Great Depression, Chaplin's films brought laughter to a world drowning in despair. Children adored him, adults admired him, critics worshipped him. He wasn't just the most famous comedian alive. He was one of the most recognizable human beings on the planet. But Hollywood has a cruel habit of turning icons into targets. And Chaplin's fall wasn't caused by a single mistake, but by a perfect storm of scandal, politics, and fear. It began in 1944 with a case that should never have become a national obsession. Joan Barry, a troubled and often unstable actress who had once auditioned for Chaplin, accused him of inappropriate behavior and filed a paternity claim. He insisted the affair never happened. Barry's own history contradicted her accusations. Yet the moment her story hit the newspapers, Chaplin, the man who had built his life on the illusion of innocence, became front-page material for all the wrong reasons. The government stepped in, not to seek justice, but to seek headlines. The FBI, already suspicious of Chaplin's political leanings, saw an opportunity. J. Edgar Hoover despised him. His foreign birth, his left-leaning politics, his influence. Hoover believed Chaplin was dangerous, subversive, a threat to America's moral and political stability. The Barry case became the perfect weapon. Chaplin was charged under the Mann Act, accused of transporting Barry across state lines for immoral purposes. It was a sensational accusation. Dramatic, salacious, perfect for tabloids. The trial became less about Barry and more about Chaplin's fate as a public figure. In reality, the evidence was flimsy. The encounter was consensual. The paternity test later proved he was not the father. The court eventually cleared him of all charges, but the damage was already done. The headlines had done their work, and then came the political storm. Chaplin spoke openly against fascism before most of Hollywood dared to. He criticized McCarthyism. He refused to become an American citizen. He used his films, most notably The Great Dictator, to speak out about war, power, and dictatorship. Many called him brave. Others called him dangerous. By the early 1950s, the anti-communist panic was at its peak. Hollywood was terrified. Politicians were desperate for enemies. And Chaplin, a foreign-born artist who championed the working class, was an easy target. In 1952, while traveling to London for the premiere of Limelight, Chaplin received a message from the U.S. government. His re-entry permit had been revoked. America had exiled him. The little tramp, who had once made the world laugh, now found himself unwanted by the country that had made him a legend. Chaplin settled in Switzerland, where he would live the rest of his life, a world away from the studios he once ruled. He continued making films, but the magic was dimmed. Hollywood had turned its back. The United States had erased him from its story. The political climate that once cheered for his comedy now cheered for his departure. Charlie Chaplin died in 1977, wealthy, respected in Europe, surrounded by family, but forever marked by the exile that Hollywood and Washington forced upon him. His story is the final lesson of Eric II. You don't need to commit a crime to be punished in old Hollywood. Sometimes the world just needs a reason, and a man too brilliant to silence. The stars in this chapter didn't serve a day behind bars. They weren't locked in cells or marched into prison yards or photographed in mugshots that circled the world. Their punishment was quieter, but far more devastating. They were tried by gossip columns, sentenced by headlines, exiled by a public that demanded perfection, and destroyed anyone who dared to fall short. Some were innocent, some were complicated, some were guilty only of being human. But in old Hollywood, that was enough to end a career, because the studios could hide a crime, but they couldn't outrun a scandal. And yet, there is a third kind of story, darker, lonelier, and far more tragic. The stories of actors who were never charged, never tried, never even given the chance to defend themselves, because they were destroyed by rumors, secrets, and mysteries that Hollywood buried deep. Part 3 begins with the stars whose lives unraveled not in courtrooms, but in whispers. Hollywood has always feared the truth, but nothing frightened it more than a mystery it couldn't control. In this final chapter, we step into the darkest corners of the Golden Age, where careers didn't end with a judge's sentence or a screaming headline, but with whispers, with secrets, with questions no one was allowed to answer. Some of these stars were caught in scandals they never understood. Some were ruined by tragedies they had no part in, and some simply vanished beneath rumors that grew louder than their own voices. These weren't criminals. They weren't tried. They weren't even given the chance to defend themselves. They were swallowed by Hollywood's most powerful weapon, silence. This is the chapter of lost reputations, unsolved mysteries, and lives rewritten by fear. It begins with the actress who walked into a murder scene and never found her way back into the light. Mabel Norman's story is where the final arc begins. Number 1, Mabel Norman, the comedian who walked into a murder mystery Hollywood never solved. Before the shadows closed in, Mabel Norman was Hollywood's brightest spark, the queen of silent comedy, the woman who helped define an entire era of film. Audiences adored her mischievous smile, her fearless physical humor, her tender charm. She worked with legends like Max Sennett and Charlie Chaplin, not as a sidekick but as an equal, sometimes even as the one giving direction. She was brilliant, she was beloved, and she had no idea how quickly the world would turn against her. The tragedy began on the night of February 1st, 1922. That evening, Mabel visited her close friend, director William Desmond Taylor, at his Los Angeles bungalow. They talked about work, about books, about her attempts to quit drinking, a quiet, intimate conversation between two friends who genuinely cared for each other. When she left around 7:45 p.m., Taylor walked her to her car, waved goodbye, and watched her leave. It was the last moment anyone saw him alive. Hours later, neighbors heard a gunshot. They found Taylor lying on the floor of his living room, dead from a single bullet to the back. The murder shocked Hollywood, it terrified it, and it needed a villain. Within days, the press exploded with speculation. Taylor had been wealthy, charming, admired. He had secrets, yes, relationships, money troubles, personal struggles, but none of them pointed to a clear suspect. The investigation spiraled in every direction: jealous lovers, studio cover-ups, criminal ties, stolen letters. And then the spotlight turned to Mabel Normand. Not because she was guilty. She wasn't. Not because she had motive. She didn't. But because the world needed someone recognizable to attach the mystery to. Someone whose proximity to the crime made good headlines. She was the last person to see him alive. That alone was enough. Tabloids invented stories faster than the police could deny them. Mabel the wild girl. Mabel the drunk. Mabel the secret lover. Mabel the woman worth killing for. None of it was true. All of it was devastating. Normand cooperated fully with the investigation. She was never arrested, never charged, never officially considered a suspect. But the suspicion clung to her like smoke. Her career, already fragile due to health issues and studio conflicts, began to collapse under the weight of whispers. Audiences who once cheered for her now stared with doubt. Producers hesitated to hire her. Every film she touched carried the stain of the unsolved murder, and fate wasn't finished with her. 2 years later, another incident dragged Mabel back into scandal. Her chauffeur, driving her car, became involved in a violent altercation during which a man was shot with a pistol linked to her household. Mabel was innocent yet again, but innocence didn't matter. Hollywood had already written its narrative. Mabel Normand was a magnet for trouble. Her health deteriorated rapidly. Years of stress, substance struggles, and the emotional fallout of endless public suspicion broke her spirit. By the late 1920s, tuberculosis had overtaken her body. She tried to mount a comeback, but the industry had moved on. Too frightened, too cautious, too unforgiving. On February 23, 1930, Mabel Normand died at just 36 years old. The official cause was illness. The unofficial cause was heartbreak. She left behind a legacy of laughter and a question mark that still haunts Hollywood a century later. Why was the woman who brought joy to millions punished for a crime she did not commit? Mabel Normand didn't die a criminal. She died a victim of rumor, of fear, and of a mystery the world refused to solve. Number 2, Mary Miles Minter, the Golden Girl, destroyed by a murder she didn't commit. Before the scandal, Mary Miles Minter was everything Hollywood wanted in its next great star. Youthful, angelic, innocent. The studio-manufactured successor to Mary Pickford. Her face was plastered across magazines. Her films drew enormous crowds. Producers predicted she would rule the silent era for decades. But beneath the soft curls and shy smile was a young woman caught in a world she barely understood, controlled by a mother whose ambitions were more dangerous than anyone realized. And then came the murder that destroyed her future. On February 2, 1922, the body of director William Desmond Taylor was discovered in his Los Angeles home. A single bullet in his back, no sign of struggle, no clear clues. It was the scandal of the century, electrifying the city and dragging every person in Taylor's orbit under a microscope, and Mary Miles Minter was suddenly in the center of the storm. When police searched Taylor's home, they found a stack of love letters from Mary, emotional, childish, filled with longing and hero worship. She was only 19. Taylor was 49. Hollywood gasped. Newspapers printed the letters in full, feeding the public a story that felt like a forbidden romance ripped from the screen. It didn't matter that nothing proved they were lovers. It didn't matter that Mary was sheltered, manipulated, and pushed into the industry too young. It didn't matter that the letters were written in a moment of teenage infatuation, not evidence of a relationship. To the public, the implication was enough. To the studios, it was a disaster. To her mother, the infamous Charlotte Shelby, it was fuel for a family implosion. Charlotte Shelby was a dominating, controlling figure who had shaped Mary's life with an iron grip. She handled Mary's finances, contracts, and public image. She also despised anyone who threatened her control, including Taylor. Soon, rumors swirled that Charlotte herself might have been involved in his death. She owned a .38 caliber pistol, the same type used in the murder. Witnesses recalled heated arguments. Others whispered about jealousy, money, and access. But whether the suspicion was rooted in truth or desperation, it tore the Minter Shelby household apart. The police never proved Mary's involvement in the case. They never proved her mother's guilt either. But the damage was already irreversible. The press devoured Mary. Tabloids called her a fallen angel. Columnists accused her of destroying Taylor through temptation. The innocence that had built her career now acted as a mirror for public outrage. Hollywood panicked. Studios canceled her contracts. Exhibitors refused to screen her films. Her once promising career collapsed in a matter of months. Mary was only 20 years old. The tragedy didn't end there. The emotional trauma fractured her family. The accusations against her mother lingered for the rest of Charlotte's life, poisoning every relationship Mary tried to build. She spiraled into depression, withdrew from public view, and eventually disappeared from Hollywood entirely. Not with a dramatic farewell, but with a quiet, devastated acceptance that her life as a star was over. Mary Miles Minter lived for 6 more decades, almost all of them in obscurity. She gave few interviews, avoided cameras, and rarely spoke of the case that destroyed her. When she died in 1984, her obituary was short, a far cry from the glowing predictions made when she was a teenager poised to inherit Hollywood. Her downfall remains one of the harshest in film history. A young woman ruined not by guilt, not by crime, but by proximity to a mystery she never had the chance to escape. Mary Miles Minter wasn't the murderer. She was a casualty of scandal, of suspicion, and of Hollywood's hunger for a story. Number 3, Joan Bennett, the noir goddess ruined by a scandal she didn't commit. By the early 1950s, Joan Bennett had become the face of cinematic shadows, the woman who practically invented the modern film noir heroine. With her dark hair, sharp eyes, and icy elegance, she turned every scene into a world of fatal secrets and whispered threats. Directors loved her. Audiences trusted her. She didn't just survive Hollywood. She steadied herself inside its fire and learned to thrive. But life has a cruel symmetry. And in 1951, Joan Bennett found herself living through a real-life noir plot she never asked for. One that would destroy her career, even though she harmed no one. It started on a quiet afternoon in a Los Angeles studio parking lot. Joan had driven there to meet Jennings Lang, her talent agent, to discuss business, a routine meeting between a major star and the man responsible for shaping her career's next steps. They sat together inside her car, talking. Nothing dramatic, nothing scandalous, nothing unusual. But Hollywood has never been good at telling the difference between truth and imagination. Joan's husband, producer Walter Wanger, arrived unexpectedly. He saw the two sitting together, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, jealousy overtook him. Wanger retrieved a .38 revolver from his glove compartment, marched toward the car, and fired. Lang collapsed, bleeding from the thigh. Bennett froze, horrified. The entire studio lot erupted into panic. Security rushed to the scene. Police sirens wailed through the lot. It was one of the most shocking acts of violence ever committed on a Hollywood studio lot. But in a twist, no screenwriter would dare include the shooter faced minimal consequences. And the innocent woman in the car became the real casualty. Wanger admitted to the shooting, pleaded temporary insanity, and served just 4 months in a county honor farm. When he emerged, his career eventually recovered. He returned to producing, returned to the studio system, returned to society. But Joan Bennett, her fate was sealed not by crime, but by assumption. Hollywood turned against her immediately. Rumors of an affair, completely unproven and later denied by both parties, spread like wildfire. Producers whispered that she had provoked the shooting simply by being in the car. Columnists labeled her a femme fatale, projecting her on-screen persona onto a tragedy that had nothing to do with seduction or deceit. The irony was devastating. Joan Bennett, a woman renowned for her noir roles, was now trapped in a scandal that resembled one. And the world believed the fiction instead of the truth. Studios dropped her. Insurers refused to cover her. Directors stopped calling, terrified of the gossip that trailed behind her name. Her career, once sophisticated and unstoppable, collapsed almost overnight. She was punished not for infidelity, not for violence, not for deception, but for being there, in the wrong place at the wrong time. Joan spent the next decade working sparsely, mostly in theater and low-budget films. She reinvented herself in television, finding success on Dark Shadows, but she never again stood at the top of the industry she once dominated. In interviews later in life, she spoke of the scandal with rare honesty. "I might as well have pulled the trigger myself," she said, "for all the damage it did me." Her words captured the cruelest truth of early Hollywood. You didn't need to commit a crime to lose everything. You only needed to be present when someone else did. Joan Bennett didn't fall from grace. She was pushed by rumor, jealousy, and a studio system that found it easier to sacrifice an innocent woman than confront an uncomfortable truth. Number 4. Ingrid Bergman, Hollywood's angel exiled for falling in love. Before the firestorm, Ingrid Bergman was adored in a way few stars ever were. She wasn't glamorous in the polished Hollywood sense. She was luminous, with a purity that felt almost untouched by fame. In Casablanca, she broke hearts. In Gaslight, she earned an Oscar for a performance so powerful, it changed the vocabulary of psychology. To America, Ingrid Bergman was not just a star, she was a symbol of goodness. And then, in 1949, that symbol shattered. It happened quietly at first. Bergman traveled to Italy to work with director Roberto Rossellini, a pioneer of neorealism, whose rough emotional filmmaking was the opposite of Hollywood's polished fantasies. The plan was simple: collaborate on a movie. But on Rossellini's set, far from the controlled machinery of American studios, Ingrid found something she hadn't felt in years: freedom. Freedom to act as herself. Freedom to escape her carefully managed persona. Freedom to fall in love. When news broke that Bergman, still married, was pregnant with Rossellini's child, the reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Hollywood froze, the public erupted, and the purity America had projected onto her became a weapon turned against her. The moral panic was unlike anything the industry had seen. Church groups condemned her, radio hosts mocked her, newspapers labeled her immoral, loose, unfit for motherhood. But the most shocking blow came from where no actor would expect it: the United States Senate. In a stunning moment of moral outrage, Senator Edwin C. Johnson publicly denounced her, calling her a powerful influence for evil, and argued that her films should be banned from American screens. The condemnation made international headlines. Bergman, bewildered and devastated, became a political symbol in a war she never chose. Hollywood reacted with equal ferocity. Studios cut ties. Contracts dissolved. Her image disappeared from posters and magazines. Offers dried up overnight. A woman who had committed no crime, no theft, no violence, no scandal beyond falling in love, was treated like a national disgrace. Exiled by the country that once worshipped her, Ingrid Bergman left America and settled in Italy with Rossellini. She continued making films, bold, complex, artistic works that challenged her in ways Hollywood never had. But to American audiences, she disappeared. For 7 years, the woman who once symbolized American innocence became the symbol of its moral outrage. Yet even in exile, Bergman refused to break. She worked, she learned, she raised her children, and she waited, knowing time has a way of rewriting stories. Her redemption came in 1956 with Anastasia. She returned to the screen with a performance filled with longing, sorrow, and quiet determination. the story of a lost woman reclaiming herself. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece. Audiences embraced her again, and the Academy awarded her an Oscar, the ultimate symbol of forgiveness from the very industry that had once exiled her. Ingrid Bergman lived the rest of her life with grace, resilience, and artistic courage. She never apologized for her choices. She never bowed to scandal, and she never allowed Hollywood's judgment to define her. Her story remains one of the most powerful examples of how a rumor, a romance, or a moral panic could crush a star, not because they committed a crime, but because they dared to be human. Ingrid Bergman wasn't destroyed by wrongdoing. She was destroyed by expectations and rebuilt by truth. Number 5. Bobby Driscoll, Disney's golden boy who died unknown and unfound. Before the darkness, Bobby Driscoll was the child Hollywood loved most. Wide-eyed, earnest, impossibly talented, he was the first boy Walt Disney ever placed under exclusive contract, the studio's chosen son. He starred in Song of the South, Treasure Island, and countless Disney shorts. And of course, he became the voice and model for Peter Pan, the boy who would never grow up. But in a cruel twist that nobody saw coming, Bobby Driscoll became the living proof that in Hollywood, some children grow up too fast, and none are protected forever. His fall didn't begin with a crime or a scandal. It began with a birthday. Around age 13, Driscoll hit puberty. His voice deepened, his face changed. The softness that made him perfect for Disney's wholesome image began to fade. In a studio built on fantasy, reality was an inconvenience. Disney executives, quietly, coldly, decided they didn't need him anymore. And without warning, Bobby Driscoll was fired. Imagine it. One day, you're the treasured star of the most powerful studio on earth, and the next, your pass doesn't work at the gate. Disney never explained. They never thanked him. They simply replaced him and moved on. Driscoll tried to find work elsewhere, but casting directors saw him only as the Disney kid. Once charming, now awkward. Once adored, now unmarketable. He struggled in school, bullied by classmates who mocked him for being a washed-up actor. For a child trained to perform, the humiliation was unbearable. And then the rumors started. Whispers of behavior issues, speculation about substance use, stories that grew in the telling, some true, some exaggerated, all harmful. By the time he turned 17, Bobby Driscoll wasn't a child star. He was a cautionary tale. Hollywood abandoned him long before he abandoned himself. Throughout the 1950s, Driscoll drifted through small roles, restlessness, addiction, and arrests for minor offenses. His parents tried to help. Therapists tried to help. Hollywood did not. The industry that created his image now recoiled from the reality of him. In his early 20s, he moved to New York, hoping to reinvent himself as an artist. And for a time, he found a strange sort of peace in the East Village art scene, surrounded by other lost, hopeful souls searching for meaning outside of fame. But poverty, addiction, and emotional scars trailed him like shadows. On March 30th, 1968, two boys playing in a deserted New York tenement building found a body. A man collapsed face down, no identification, no wallet, no name. The medical examiner recorded him as a vagrant who died of heart failure. Nobody claimed him. Nobody recognized him. Nobody knew they had found Peter Pan. He was buried in a pauper's grave on Hart Island, the burial place of the unclaimed. Disney would not learn what happened to him until 1972, 4 years later, when fingerprint records finally identified the body. By then, the world had adapted to his absence. Studios stayed silent. Newspapers printed small blurbs. And the boy who once symbolized eternal youth was gone, forgotten, erased. Bobby Driscoll didn't die because of crime, scandal, or corruption. He died because Hollywood built him for fantasy and discarded him the moment he became real. His story is the darkest truth of the Golden Age, in a town obsessed with youth, innocence, and magic. No one ever teaches a child star how to grow up. Number 6, Barbara Payton, the starlet Hollywood watched fall and did nothing to save. Before the tabloids tore her apart, Barbara Payton was a revelation. With icy blonde hair, hypnotic eyes, and a presence that felt both vulnerable and dangerous, She was the kind of woman Hollywood adored. Casting agents called her unstoppable. Directors saw a future legend. Studios saw a gold mine. In 1950, Peyton starred opposite James Cagney, a badge of honor for any rising actress. Critics whispered that she could be the next big thing, but Hollywood's love affairs are fragile, and Peyton's would become one of the most tragic in its history. Her downfall didn't begin with a scandal. It began with two men. Actor Franchot Tone, a refined leading man, fell hopelessly in love with her. Actor Tom Neal, a volatile film noir tough guy with a violent streak, became obsessed. Peyton didn't know it yet, but she was about to become the center of a tabloid war. Neal and Tone both courted her, often at the same time, and the rivalry escalated into jealousy, threats, and whispered rumors. Hollywood watched with morbid fascination. Peyton, still navigating fame, tried to manage the chaos, but chaos has a way of choosing its own path. The breaking point came in September 1951. Neal, enraged and intoxicated by possessiveness, confronted Tone in a penthouse apartment. What followed was one of the most infamous beatings in Hollywood history. Neal assaulted Tone so brutally he was left with a smashed cheekbone, a concussion, and injuries that required extensive medical care. The newspapers exploded. But instead of condemning the man who committed the violence, the press aimed its knives at the woman at the center of it all, Barbara Peyton. They called her wild, reckless, a man-eater. They said she provoked the fight. They blamed her for the downfall of both men. And Hollywood, obsessed with protecting its male stars, agreed. Studios cut her loose instantly. Contracts evaporated. Producers labeled her too risky. The same industry that had promised her the world now watched from a safe distance as she fell apart. But the worst part wasn't the professional collapse. It was that the scandal followed her everywhere. She tried to marry Franchot Tone, hoping to stabilize her life. But the marriage lasted only 53 days, undone by jealousy, violence, and endless scrutiny. When Tone left her, the studios did too. Tom Neal drifted back into obscurity, but Peyton carried the weight of both men's sins. By the mid-1950s, Barbara Peyton was working in B-movies. By the late 1950s, she was working in bars. By the early 1960s, she was surviving through sex work, scamming, and addiction. The brutal realities of a woman Hollywood had not just abandoned, but actively destroyed. And then came the final indignity. In 1963, she published a memoir titled, I Am Not Ashamed, a defiant, heartbreaking attempt to reclaim her story. But even that backfired. Instead of empathy, she received mockery. Critics dismissed her. Hollywood ignored her. The public laughed. 2 years later, on May 8, 1965, Barbara Peyton died at only 39 years old, penniless, malnourished, and alone in a dilapidated apartment in Los Angeles. Her death barely made the news. Barbara Peyton's story is not one of scandal, but of scapegoating. She didn't fall because of crime. She fell because Hollywood needed someone to blame, and she was the easiest target. A woman punished for the chaos of men, destroyed by a tabloid machine that found her downfall more entertaining than her talent. In the end, these final stories weren't about crimes or trials or scandals splashed across front pages. They were about something quieter and far more destructive. Rumors, misunderstandings, whispers in studio hallways, secrets buried under decades of silence. Some of these stars were pulled into mysteries they never caused. Some were punished for presence, not guilt. And some were simply too fragile, too hopeful, or too human for an industry that demanded perfection and devoured imperfection. Hollywood didn't need a verdict to destroy them. It only needed a narrative. Across all 3 arcs, 20 lives collided with the same truth. The golden age wasn't golden for everyone. Behind every spotlight was a shadow, and behind every legend was a cost someone had to pay. We've followed the actors who were jailed, the ones destroyed by headlines, and the ones erased by whispers. And now, as the curtain falls, we're left with one final truth. In old Hollywood, the brightest stars didn't just shine, they burned.